Hello, and welcome to Making Known the Unknown. The title of today's show is Accomplishments of Religion Part 2. I'm your host, Tina Tarryk, and with me are my regular guests and experts, Sidney Schwartz, middle school teacher and Bible researcher from Hackensack, New Jersey. Welcome, Sidney.
Hi, Tina.
And Reverend Hewitt, founder and pastor of Gifts of the Spirit Church in Chesterfield, Connecticut, and medium. Welcome, Carl.
Thank you.
Okay. As some of you may or may not be aware, we have a very unique show where quite a bit of the information, I'll call it knowledge, that we share with the viewers comes from a combination of Reverend Hewitt's mediumship and Sidney Schwartz's research. And what's been put together is a little bit of a clip that really explains how this information comes to be. If we could have that clip, please.
In the Bible, Paul explains that everyone has two bodies, a physical body and a spiritual body. Mediums use their spiritual bodies when they act as a communication bridge between the physical and spirit worlds. As a spirit speaks, mediums hear the information using the ears of their spiritual bodies, then repeat the information to other physical people. Mediumship is synonymous with the biblical term, Gifts of the Spirit. The focus of our show, Making Known the Unknown, is to provide knowledge through the use of Reverend Hewitt's mediumship and Sidney Schwartz's research. The Bible contains the history of psychic events, along with man-made doctrines created by priests centuries ago. This show will explore the untruths which the Bible entrenched into our society. By uncovering these untruths, we encourage people everywhere to think for themselves with a critical mind.
Thank you. So this show you could look at as a result of accumulated knowledge. The knowledge has been accumulated between Sidney Schwartz and Reverend Hewitt. What I'd like to do is recap a little bit from our last show, Accomplishments of Religion. When we start out this series, we sometimes don't know we're going to go into a part 1, part 2, so on and so forth. And there tends to be quite a bit of information to share with you with respect to accomplishments of religion. What do we mean by accomplishments of religion? An example I can give you from the last show is that as a result of some people's fanatic magnetism towards religious dogma, we actually have seen throughout the country what we could call Christian terrorists. That was one topic that we went over, and it was as a result of a young man, his name is Eric Rudolph, who believed because essentially God told him so. He bombed an abortion clinic and did several other atrocities. And so what we're trying to do in tonight's show, and that wasn't, of course, the only thing we discussed in the last show, is to show people that by following a religion, not thinking independently for yourself, you actually stand to lose your ability to, how should I say this? I'm going to repeat myself, function independently and go throughout your world really thinking for yourself. And that's been the big push with this show. The focus for the show is not for people to, quote unquote, buy into what we are sharing with them, but we just want you to listen. And there really is no harm in listening. But a clue is that if you're afraid to listen and it disturbs you to listen and you are moved to change the channel or switch to doing something else, that should raise up a red flag in your mind. Because perhaps you're afraid. Perhaps you're afraid of opening your mind and listening to something different. So tonight's show, Accomplishments of Religion Part 2, we're going to sort of pick up where we left off. And we had also talked about the history of priests with respect to their attire and behavior being quite effeminate. Sidney Schwartz had brought a lot of that research to the surface. and the effeminate connections with respect to the young boys in church. I think that's where we kind of left off. And if you want to take it from
right.
there?
Where
Okay.
we discussed the last time was the fact that the priests wear these cassocks, which is like a skirt, like attire, because they were imitating the homosexual effeminate priests of the goddesses who used to be mediums and used to make themselves as feminine as possible, so that the goddess would work through them. And they were very highly revered by their societies. Phrygia was one of the places where this took place, and since the priests were trying to step into that role of being revered by the people, they imitated the attire of these men.
Okay. Now, you had also pulled up some research with respect to young boys in the church, and I guess we were going to pick it up from there. And it has to do with actually the history of castration to some degree. I don't know if that's where you want to begin with this.
We can begin there.
Okay.
Basically, I went on the internet and I discovered that there's a group of people called the castrati, and they were men, young boys actually, who most of the time they had, before puberty, they'd have a high soprano voice. And they were forcibly castrated by members of the church, and then they would sing in the Vatican choir. The priests there liked the high sound of their voice, and of course they could have had women sing the soprano parts. However, because in the Bible it says that a woman should not be allowed to speak in church, therefore she wasn't allowed to sing in church either. So back in the early 1600s, in fact it was 1589, it was Pope Sisto V passed a bull, papal bull, which said that it sanctioned the use of castrati in the Vatican. And during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, some 4,000 to 5,000 Italian boys were castrated and sang in the choir. And in fact, the practice didn't really die out until 1959. So it went all the way into the mid-20th century. And this is one of the things that the church practiced.
So because women were not allowed to speak in church,
Right.
and they wanted that high-pitched voice for singing, they castrated young men
Yes.
for this purpose.
And in the articles that I was reading on the internet, it said that lots of times it wasn't voluntary. They involuntarily castrated them.
Really?
Yes.
And this has continued up to not too long ago.
Up until 1950s, so about 50 years ago, 40 years ago.
Okay, so now women were being pulled out of the church, although they, according to your research and in other shows, were more in tune with spirit
Yes.
because of the magnetic effect on their souls.
Yes.
And men who were gay were no longer able to do that and then became priests. Can you kind of connect that for me?
Well, again, females have a negative charge in their soul. That's not good and bad. It's just a polarity. Males have a positive charge. The negative charge allows females to be in contact with the spirit world a lot easier than males are. A homosexual person has a female soul in a male body. Okay. Therefore, they have both a blending of the positive and negative energies. In actuality, God is both male and female. It talks about in the Bible where the souls, when it talks about Adam and Eve in the story of the rib being taken out of Adam and made into Eve, the Hebrew word really means side. And many Jewish scholars, such as Rashi, used to say that they took the female side out of Adam and created Eve. So there was initially human beings had both positive and negative charges in them. They were separated into male and female. So that the homosexual is more like God because they have both the positive and negative energy, and therefore they can communicate as well as a woman, in some cases even better, because they have both frequencies in them. And it allows them to be an instrument of the spirit or a medium depending on which terminology you like to use.
Okay, but I'm sure at some point men being gay were not accepted in the church, because look where we are now. So how did that continue?
They weren't accepted in the Catholic Church, but
Okay.
as we were saying, when goddesses were supreme and matriarchy existed, these homosexuals were the priests, and they were the ones who were bringing forth the goddess and allowing the goddess to speak to the people. So they were highly revered because they were the only source to have this happen. In the Indian culture, it was the same thing with the Bradachis. They were the ones. They were also the effeminate men who would the great white spirit would speak through them, and they lived as a gay man would. They had relationships with males, and this was all very well accepted in the Indian culture, in the Native American culture.
Did you bring a picture of a goddess with you? I remembered you talking about that.
Yeah, we did when we were going to talk about the history of women going way back and matriarchy.
Okay.
If you want to jump to that.
I just wanted to cover a couple more pieces right here.
Sure.
You had also talked about that because the church had denounced people who were homosexual, that almost forced them into becoming priests. Am I correct with that?
Yes.
And then we could kind of go back and
yes, that's what we talked about last week. The fact that as we spoke on so many shows that the soul has memory, and that sometimes we, just like a young child could sit down at a piano and with very few lessons play very well. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's because they have that memory of playing that instrument in the soul. They have the knack for it, and so just as that happens, in many homosexual men, they have this inner knowing that they're supposed to be the intermediary between God and the people. They're supposed to be the mediums. But in the 300s, when the church got rid of the position of mediums and they threw the prophets out, in those days they used the word prophets, and they stopped prophecy, and they declared that all prophecy ceased at the Council of Nicaea, and they stopped all that. Well, then there was that position wasn't there, and the only person who said they were in the intermediary between God and the people were the priests. So therefore, the homosexuals were drawn towards the priesthood, and they've been there for eons, for millennium. As we mentioned last week, there was a book called the Book of Gomorrah that was published in 1054. Where this was one priest Damien, was denouncing all the homosexual priests that there were in the church back in 1054. Well, not much has changed, and that's because so many gay people are drawn to the clergy, and it's not just of the Catholic churches. In all the churches, many of the clergy people, if they're not openly gay, they're latent gays.
Okay. I guess one of the key pieces here is that we're still talking about men. We're talking about men in church, men in religion, and at some point you had mentioned that there was a connection with goddesses and women, and it seems that something may have gone awry in history with respect to women no longer really playing a major part in the church, and you had mentioned you had some information to share with us about your research on that.
There's a book that I brought to your attention, and it's called Castrated Women. It's by Naomi Miller Stokes. And in this book, she has a whole chapter about even though it's called Castrated Women, it's really about hysterectomy. But she goes into the history of women going back to the Stone Age and the history of medicine, and it eventually talks about the subject of hysterectomy. And if we go back, it's about 27,000 years ago. The Stone Age people, they worshipped women, and if we could have that graphic brought up on the screen as we talk, this particular goddess is called the Venus of Willendorf, and she's named after. She was found about 4 miles outside of Vienna, Austria. She was discovered in 1908. And there's many different statues like this, and you can see that it highlights the female features of this particular goddess. and she was produced by Cro-Magnon man, and the Upper Paleolithic artists in the Carpathian Mountains made her. Basically, men were in awe of women because women did things that men couldn't. First of all, they were healers. They were the natural healers. They were the natural medicine women. They were the mothers. And they brought forth life, and men couldn't figure out how that was all done. And so she was worshipped for quite a long time, and religion was part of the feminine domain, as was keeping the family together, and it was just natural that the whole idea of medicine was being taken care of by women instead of men, because men were just going out and being food gatherers. And to keep the culture going and the society going at those days, it was all in the hands of women. But what basically happened is that there was a migration of Indo-Europeans that came into this particular area, and they had a different philosophy, because what basically happened was that when man was a hunter and nomadic, the women were all society was based on matriarchy. The women were in charge. But then people decided it would be better to live in cities, and when you lived in a city, you needed protection, and therefore they built walls around the city, and they also had armies to protect the cities from invasion. And that's where male energy started to become more supreme over women's energy. And it was at that point that that men started to take away the domain of women, because basically there was a switch there, and they went from revering women and worshiping them to making them obey their commands, because now they were in charge. So as far as religion, they started to have less priestesses and more priests, and when it came to medicine, it was the same thing. When you got to Egypt, and we all know that when someone died, they would embalm them. Mm-hmm. And what basically happened was they would take a lot of the organs out of the body. So there was a lot of that kind of surgery going on, and that was all under the auspices of men. So it started to come out that women's medicine became superstitious, and male medicine became scientific, because they would do all the operations. They knew the parts of the body. You could see what you're doing with that. It became very physical. While looking at an herb, you can't really tell if it's going to help you or not. So there became this switch. It switched from matriarchy to patriarchy, and it happened in medicine as well as in religion. And the thing about it is that initially religion and medicine were very intertwined. You didn't have one without the other, because it was, when women were in charge of it, it was all invisible. You're talking about all the invisible energy, about the plants helping and so forth. And as medicine became more scientific, then it became less, obvious that it became less of a domain for women.
Okay. So could I kind of go back and pull that together? So basically, the change started when other religions or other invasions of religious groups came through with their ideals and their practices, and slowly it became more patriarchal versus matriarchal?
From the way I understand it, it's partially that, and partially when people decided to live in cities and they needed the protection. It was and it seemed that both happened at once. The Indo-Europeans came in and they decided they wanted to have cities and reorganize things in cities, and that's when this switch came through, and that's when medicine became anti-mystical and became more into a science. And even in the Egyptians, that was going on. Now,
I had also read that with respect to the Egyptian society, that many of the queens throughout Egyptian history were notable physicians and priestesses.
Yes.
And that wasn't uncommon for them to take that role on. And it would appear, because you mentioned about the living in the cities, that was one piece. But I also read that much of the Hebrew society really denigrates women, and still does today, with respect to them not being allowed to speak in certain areas. And of course, this really is your area of expertise.
It goes back to the fact, again, that there was one God. They had one God, it was male.
Okay.
And since it was male, it was in charge of healing. And since it was in charge of healing, women couldn't be healers. They couldn't do any of that because their one God was male. With some of these other polytheistic religions where there were more than one God, some of them did have gods and goddesses. So it left room for some priestesses and some priests. That went along for quite a while.
So it stands to reason.
Cultures.
Excuse me. So it stands to reason that the groups that were most powerful at the time had the one male God, coming away from the notion of goddesses. Because look where we are today.
No, I wouldn't say that.
You wouldn't.
No. I
Okay.
would say in the course of religious evolution, that happened because the Bible came along and that became the cornerstone.
Okay.
But if you go back to the ancient Hebrews, they were very much against the goddess Asherah, who had the homosexual priest, giving messages out. And so the other religions of the time did have goddesses, but they were very much against it because they had their one male God. So as time went on, and Christianity came out as an outbranch of Judaism, and then that became the very dominant force, well, then everything became very entrenched at that point, and of course it all centered around the Bible. But when the actual time it was happening, there was a lot more conflict about it, and that's why the Hebrew people were so xenophobic and so afraid to be contaminated by these other groups, because this was going on in other places. So it wasn't until all the pagans were conquered by Christianity and they were ruling, quite strongly, that all this really became solidified, you could say.
All right. So one male god, and here we go. And so male gods lead to men in charge of the religious practices of the day.
That's right.
The government.
And medicine, surprisingly.
And medicine.
And it got to the point that by the 15th century, when a doctor went to practice a medicine, they had to have a priest there. And it was at the same point that if a woman tried to practice medicine, well, then she was practicing the witchcraft, because see, the Christians viewed sickness as being related to sin. So the only way that you can get rid of your sickness is to be forgiven religiously. And therefore, to go outside of that matrix, you're dealing with Satan, basically. And that's why women supposedly were under Satan's spell, because they were doing the herb stuff, and which was outside of the church's realm, and therefore they said that they were working with the devil, and that was which is what led to witchcraft, which is what led to all the burnings and everything else of women, and eventually led to a lot worse things happening to them. But it's all because religion and medicine were so tied together.
Now, women were performing healings or medicine that was not, shall we say, with tangible objects. It was more spiritual, herbal, maybe grounded,
Yes.
for lack of a better term.
Yes.
And so that was confusing to the men, who then took over.
No, I wouldn't say it was confusing. It was threatening.
Threatening,
And
okay.
because it threatened their power, they would go and squelch it.
So they just got rid of it and said it was something bad and of the devil and evil,
Right, and turned it into witchcraft.
turned it into something negative.
Witchcraft and sorcery.
Okay. So that's really the foundation of what we know today as the term for witches and sorceresses.
Yes.
And why there seems to be a negative connotation to that,
Right.
when there really
Because
shouldn't be.
they were trying to heal outside of the religious dogma, saying that in order to be healed, you have to be forgiven your sins by God.
Okay.
Tying sin and health together.
All right. So then a priest had to be present if a doctor was going to operate,
At a certain point in time, yes, in the 1500s.
and that person had to confess to their sins because they were sick?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And what if they didn't confess?
They probably weren't treated.
So they could refuse treating people.
I would think.
Interesting. So then medical society and the church were intertwined, as
Very,
you'd mentioned
very
before.
Very much so, especially during the Middle Ages and up to the 17th century. By the 17th century, the church said it knew what was wrong with women. And it was not only the fact that they were tempted by, quote, the devil so much, but the fact that they had different organs in their body, and it was these organs that created the problems. If you go back into the very first Bible in English, which was the Wycliffe Bible of 1584, when we spoke about Zephaniah on this show, and it's when King Saul said, "Find me a woman who has a spirit of prophecy in it." Okay, the very first one said, "Find me a woman that has a fiend in her womb." A fiend in her womb.
What do you think that meant?
Well, a fiend is like a demon, okay, and it was located in the womb because women were susceptible to the devil, and of course it was because of their sex and of their organs. And this whole way that everything's all tied up together, it was right in the earliest Bibles, because that's the way they translate it. You can see their theology in it.
At that particular time, the church would send a man by that house where that woman was, and he would go to the house with a bucket of tar and something else, and with a big stick and with something on it, and he would paint an X over the door so everybody would know that she was an evil woman and she had a fiend in her belly.
Oh my goodness.
And nobody would touch him. They said, you know, she had the devil in her.
Just because she was female?
Just because she was female, and she would not cooperate with the church.
Oh.
And she might have been a healer. She might have been a healer.
Okay, there you go.
She was not cooperating with the church. Exactly.
No, to me it just seems that because of the shift in the armies and the cities and what have you in history, that the knowledge with respect to the female body and female medicine was lost. And it then became a study of men, by men, for men, it would appear. And anything female is outcast.
Religious control, mind control.
Okay.
That's all there was to it.
I would say that it probably was driven way underground, you know, especially when all the persecutions happened, because even Carl, your grandmother was a healer, and she was a herbalist.
Fabulous healer.
Why don't you talk about her?
My grandmother, I was very, very small, and she was so frightened that she would not have anybody come to the house during the daytime. It was always at night, and they would come, and she would always do it in the dark. And I do remember, I was very, very small when they were building the main highway, the North-South Highway 17, and it went by out in front of their house, and there was one of the construction men that almost cut his leg off in that construction, and it seemed like everybody knew about her. And one of the men wrapped something around his leg so it wouldn't bleed to death, and they took him on their shoulders and they rushed him to the house, which was not very far. And I was just this little boy. I don't even think I was 2 years old. And she took some, I guess it was old bed sheets or something like that, and wrapped up his leg. And in a matter of minutes, stopped the blood and took care of him and wrapped his leg up. And 2 days later, he was back on the job. And I don't know what she did, but he was healed, and he went right back to work 2 days later. And I look back on that, to me, it was miraculous what she did. A lot of people went at nighttime after dark, and even my own mother, years later, she wouldn't talk about it. I mean, she was still scared to death that she would be burned at the stake or something like that. I mean, after all those years, you know, absolute ignorance, the way they were treated.
You have to remember that Carl comes from a very strict Baptist background, so the community he was living was very Baptist. And they also viewed this kind of healing as the work of the devil.
Yeah.
But yet his grandmother was practicing this I guess herbology might be the right term for it, which probably had its roots going back for centuries. So even though was driven underground, and at one point very underground with the witch craze in the 1500s, it still somehow survived and it was still being practiced, even in the early 20th century.
When she grew her vegetable garden, over on the far side of the vegetable garden, there was 3 or 4 rows on that vegetable garden, and she would grow things, certain herbs and things, which I have no idea what it was. The only thing I remember, and remember it very well, she would grow this, what was it I used to call it? It was something she used to have in a jar, and it was gold in color, and people would come to the house and get a jar of that. For some reason or other, it would heal just about anything. People would put it on cuts and sores and stuff, and she would give it to everybody. She never charged anything, but people would give her things in exchange for whatever she did. And she's been gone a long, long time. And her own mother, I understand, was also a healer. Because in those days, people didn't have any money, but some people were born with these gifts. They were gifts of the Spirit, which is in the Bible. But
That's amazing that after hundreds and hundreds of years,
yeah,
there's still this idea that somehow what they're doing is something bad and people have to go visit them in the night. And it's
Yeah.
such a shame because it's coming from the earth.
right.
More natural than scientifically reproduced drugs.
And the thing is that sometimes the medicine, the pharmaceutical companies, like for digitalis, that was something that the herbalists used to use.
Excuse me, balsam camellia. I have no idea what it is. I have no
It just
idea what
came
it
to
is,
you.
but from the time I was 2 years old, I remember that word, balsam camellia.
Really?
People came from everywhere to get that formula for her that she would make. I don't know what it was.
I mean, that's from the earth. How much
Yeah.
more natural and good and wholesome
Yeah.
can it be?
Sure.
We talk about saving the planet,
Yeah.
yet we're, what are we saving if we're not using plants and herbs to help people? We're relying on artificial things.
And I'll bet you
Flip-flopped.
I'll bet you anything that is made in some laboratory today but under another name. Sure.
Now, you were talking about digitalis.
Right. Well, that was a medicine that you probably need a prescription for today,
Right.
but yet it's an herb that comes from a tree or something
Right.
that some medicine person prescribed centuries ago.
Right, right.
So not all of this stuff is all chemicals. Some of it's natural, as you're saying.
And I have found out one thing, that the gifts of the Spirit are usually handed down through a family, usually from a female to a male to a female to a male. And so my grandmother had it. She had the healing gift and down the line, and I have, for a long time, I had the healing gift. And the clairvoyant, clairaudient gift. I had the healing. There's a lot of things have happened in my life with other people through the gift of healing with me.
See, this is why in the Bible, if you go back to the way things were originally set up, Aaron was Moses' brother. Okay, he was gifted. He was clairaudient, just like Moses was, and he was ordained to be the first priest, because the gifts of the Spirit were supposed to be genetically passed down. The Hebrew word for priest is kohen, which means a person with a familiar spirit, or a person who is a medium. And they were supposed to be the intermediaries between God and the people, but they got very corrupt and they lost their gifts, within a few generations. But that's the way it was supposed to be, and that's why the Hebrew priesthood was supposed to have been passed down genetically, because the gift was being passed down genetically.
But I have a little comment to make, but I'm going to go back to the early part of your talk here, you and Sid. I found it, I can't remember where I found it, but I think it was dealing with one of the big books that I have in my office, research. I found a research where there was a pope going way back. I don't know how far back I'm going, but he was gay. This pope was gay. And but I think the Vatican destroyed all the records. But I found, what was that guy's name that wrote all those big books?
I think you're talking about the Vicar of Christ.
No. What was the big books that I have in my office?
Oh, Arthur Findlay?
Arthur Findlay. Arthur Findlay was a very wealthy man. When he found out about mediumship, and he did a lot of research. He was not a medium. He did a lot of research. And he left his estate outside of London. He left it as a college for the gifted people. And it is the only college I know of on the planet today for people who has the gifts of spirit. And he wrote a lot of books about this, and the Vatican burned most of them, you know, but there, it was King Philip, is it?
No, it was Prince Charles.
Prince Charles. Prince Charles donated $250,000 to have them reprinted, and
Really?
they reprinted in paperback. Huge books.
They've been out of print for years.
He wrote the Psychic,
Psychic Stream, yeah.
huh?
The Psychic Stream.
The Psychic Stream, which he said that years ago the Psychic Stream ran above ground. Everybody could see it, but the church eventually ran it underground so nobody could see it. He wrote that book. Fabulous book. And so in his research, he found out the truth about this Pope, that he was really a homosexual from the time he went in and became a Pope, all the way through the time he was, until he died.
You know what I find a shame with all of this
Yeah.
is that so much is being hidden.
Oh,
So
yeah.
much is being taught to people to be ashamed of,
Yeah.
or to stay away from, or to be fearful of.
Yeah,
And it just doesn't make any sense at all.
doesn't make a bit of sense.
If this person was good enough to be a pope, so what if he was homosexual? Who
Yeah.
cares? And if women are good enough to be healers, so what? Why is it driven underground?
Yeah.
Why is there something so negative? I think one of the answers is, again, the title of the show, which is Accomplishments of Religion.
Right.
I mean, we really kind of have that whole history to thank for some of the ways that people feel and think and act about things which really have no basis in truth at all, and in fact are harmful to not welcome and open their arms and eyes
And
to.
we're still at the tip of the iceberg because there's a lot more to talk about.
Okay.
This entity that appeared to me and told me about the Merlot wine.
Okay.
Want to hear that story?
Speaking of healing, we're going to discuss Merlot wine a little bit here. So we're going to digress, and Carl's been dying to tell everyone this story. So go ahead, and then we'll get back to healing.
This is a true story, people. And some of you will think this is something made up. It isn't made up at all. I was having a glass of wine. This was in 1997. And as one of my students came to the house, and he brought a bottle of wine, and we were sitting outside. It was a beautiful, beautiful evening. And so we both poured a glass of wine, Merlot wine, and I wasn't used to Merlot wine. So we poured a glass of wine, and we were sitting there. I felt the presence of someone with me, and I'm kind of used to that now. But it wasn't a person in the physical. And he sat down, and I said, he said, well, what's new? I said, I'd rather not talk right now because I feel the presence of somebody with me. And he says, oh, okay. This was my student that said, okay. And I said, I'd rather sit quietly for a minute because I have a feeling that I'm going to hear some news or I'm going to be talking to someone. And so I had a slug of the wine, and this voice said to me, because I'm clairaudient, and oftentimes I get information from another dimension, and the entity said to me, do you happen to know where Merlot wine comes from, originated from? I says, well, I have a feeling I'm about to find out. And so the entity said, it didn't come from your planet. And I says, well, I'm interested in finding out. He said it came from another planetary system a few million years ago. Well, my ears sort of perked up. And this student of mine was watching the expression on my face because he couldn't hear the voice while I was hearing the voice. And he said it was brought here by the giants that came here millions of years ago. Well, some of you probably heard that this planet was populated by the giants. And he said it came here by the giants millions of years ago. And he said Merlot wine is actually the best wine that you can buy because it's good for the brain. And said that it's really the best wine that you can buy. And he said that the civilization that came here and brought this wine came from the 23rd universe. I said, where is the 23rd universe? And he said, I won't even bother telling you about it because you wouldn't understand. But it's millions of miles from this planet. And said that one of these days you will understand more about it, but there's a certain group from my planetary system that's already been visiting your planet, and we are leaving what you know as calling cards on your planet. They're called crop circles. I said, yeah, I'm getting to know. To know quite a bit about them. He says we won't show our faces, as you know that to be, or our machines, because we're afraid of you people. I said, why? He said, you have guns and bombs and you're out to destroy everything you don't know and everything you don't understand. He says, we don't have those machines. We don't have guns, and our brains operate 100%. He says, yours don't. He says, you are evil people. And he says, our planetary systems do not have religions.
Really?
Our planetary systems, plural.
Right.
We do not have religions. And he says, we do not die. We live forever. Our bodies don't age. He says, our bodies never age.
Just for our viewers to know this, Reverend Hewitt often will be sitting someplace calmly, pondering a thought, and many, many times he'll receive communications. So this is not unusual for him. So for those of you out there, if this seems strange, this is the way it goes in the life of a medium. And a lot of the knowledge that comes through and has come through to Reverend Hewitt and to Sidney Schwartz, what will happen is usually Carl will get this information and Sidney will research it. He'll go out and find it or be guided to find it and in fact confirm it. And thus the foundation for this show and many, many shows to come and their book.
Making known the unknown.
But I did want to touch upon something. I don't know if we can really get into the 23rd universe and the giants that used to live here, but we definitely could at another show. But I did want to ask about the wine. So how come when we drink Merlot wine now, we just get drunk and fall down? How come nothing that I know of wonderfully happens?
We're not supposed to drink it to the point that we get drunk.
Okay.
They said drink it within reason.
All right.
And they said that there was one wine that Jesus enjoyed, and it was Merlot wine.
Are you kidding me?
And they said that most of you, if you know anything about Jesus,
Right.
and he did drink wine and he loved it.
Okay.
And he said this is why there are certain religions that know that he enjoyed wine, and there is wine he used in a lot of his ceremonies. And that story about him in the Last Supper, he was drinking wine.
Okay.
He drank a lot of it, too.
Okay. All right.
And he said that business of him drinking just juice was stupid.
All right. Okay. So there is some truth in that fact.
Scientists now understand that drinking red wine is very beneficial to the brain. There's some sort of chemical in it that helps oxygenate the brain.
Okay.
I don't remember the name of the chemical, but there's something in it, and that's why.
I don't remember that chemical either.
But it's even people
Was it resveratrol? Something like that?
Something like that. Something like that. And that's why they even have done studies in France where they drink so much wine but eat high cholesterol stuff, but yet they don't have heart disease to determine whether it's the wine that's really preventing them to have the heart disease despite the cholesterol.
So there was a connection there when we were talking about healing with respect to the healing properties of Merlot wine.
Right.
Very interesting. Okay. Thank you for that digression. It actually did make a connection there.
Right.
Sidney, what did you want to continue with?
Well, getting back to the women and what happened to them. As we said, by the 17th century, the church decided that it's the women's bodies that allowed them, and their different organs that made them susceptible to diseases and of course to the working of the devil. But by the 19th century, the medical community really jumped on that bandwagon real strongly, and they actually stated that they came up with the word hysteria. And the word hysteria comes from the Greek word, and it means suffering caused by the uterus. And so if a woman had any kind of problem where she was more emotional than she should be, or quote hysterical, or whatever, they would go in and start removing some of the female organs, whether it be the ovaries or the uterus, and they would think that would make everything okay. So if a husband was having a problem with his wife and she was a little bit too demanding on him, well, then they performed this operation. They would do it for any kind of reason that you could think of, just because they made the assumption, going back to this religious idea, that the female organs were the source of negativity. And then when you compound it, even if you take that one step further and remove it, and go back to soul memory, most of the time women come back as reincarnated as women. So they've had experiences where they've experienced these horrific operations. You have to remember, back in the early 1900s, they didn't have anesthesia or anything, so they'd go in there and it would be like torture, on what they used to do. So women began to kind of dislike what made them women, what made them female, and they would dislike their breasts, they would dislike their ovaries and their uterus, and that's why all these cancers are formed, because basically it's the way you think that it affects diseases. We've talked about that on this show, and because they hated the part that they hated, men had it made, so they hated being a woman. They hated the parts of their bodies that made them a woman, and therefore there's all this kind of cancer that manifests because of the way women think.
If they hate the organ, that organ in the body,
Right.
it causes it to go bad.
So again, this is a connection of thoughts
Yes.
manifesting into real
That's right.
illness or disease.
So whether you think it's soul memory that causes it, or the fact that so many times women, up until the 1960s, women were treated so horrifically. They didn't have rights. They couldn't they couldn't do anything that a man could.
Right.
And so therefore that also made them turn against their gender, and made them dislike, because why can't I be more like a man? It's basically, because they would feel, I'm just as good as any man is. And so it's it all caused this.
Now, you also had research, and we covered this in another show, where you went back to the Hittite kingdom in Turkey with respect to abuses
Right.
To little girls at that time.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that memory of those events and those crises staying in their souls and continuing on and on and on. And then in other lifetimes, those little girls wishing to come back as males.
Right.
And so that is also a similar situation to what you're talking about
Yes,
now. Women who
yes.
were literally, it sounds like they were butchered and having their
Yes.
organs removed for lack of knowledge. Or
Right.
maybe it was there, but it went underground. And
Well,
so,
Lack of knowledge, but also because they believed what the religions were teaching them. That this religious idea was so entrenched, going back from the 15th century onward, that the medical profession just went along with it.
I can remember just reading, and this wasn't too long ago, that in many, many cultures, even our own, that women were encouraged to have bed rest, not be too intellectually stimulated, not go to college, not go beyond just being a wife and a reproductive organ. That wasn't too long ago.
No.
It really wasn't. And so
And
some of the basis in this is exactly what you're talking about.
In the 1880s, women weren't allowed to address people in public, let alone in a church. Just in a public lecture, she couldn't give a public lecture, because that was against the rules in those days. Carl and I visited the Women's Historical Museum in Sarasota Springs, New York, one time, and we learned all about that, because I hadn't been aware of that before. And it talked about the women's rights movements and the suffragettes and how that all started back in the 1880s, and just in order to allow women to vote.
So you're specifically talking about, with the book that you read, that hysterectomies themselves, the word and then the operation that's performed, in its basis of truth, or where it actually came from, was really kind of just to silence women for lack of understanding them, their emotions, their bodies.
Yes.
Just cut it out.
At least that's the way it was. Now I don't know if it still is that way, or but back in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, yes, that definitely is what the author was saying.
Now, one of the other things that comes to mind with respect to healing and the body, and you touched upon cancer a little bit, and that some of the thoughts that women could have about really not liking being a woman, not liking the parts of their body, could manifest itself into a disease?
Yes.
Carl, do you have some feedback on that?
Well, there's another thing too that I try to get across to people. If a person is always passing judgment on another person, if they don't like their neighbor or something, if a coworker dislikes another person, and they're always saying, "You son of a gun," and all that stuff, and they're constantly sending out negative thoughts. Well, that negative thought will never touch that person. I don't care what they think or say about that person, because they're creating that on their own vibration. Every person vibrates and thinks on a different frequency, a different vibration on their own, different vibration. And they're sending it out on their own vibration. And it goes out into the ether waves, and eventually it grows up. It grows up just like we all grow up. And eventually it looks for its mother, father, creator, which is the one that sent it out. It'll come back, and it attaches itself to the light field that's around the body, which is created by our own soul. And it stays there. And eventually it causes the body to go at war with itself, which is cancer. That is what cancer is all about.
So if we talk about breast cancer, ovarian cancer, very organ-specific cancers,
Yes.
that women are afflicted with, that's what's going on there.
That's what's going on there.
And it may
Because
be, okay.
Let's face it, Tina, we come into the world as two bodies. Go into the book of Corinthians, chapter 15.
Yes.
Chapter 15 says we're born with two bodies. We're born with a physical body and we're born with a spiritual body, all together in one. Physical body we see in the mirror. We do not see the spirit body because it's invisible, just like this air, this oxygen in this room is. And when we die, death gives birth to the spirit body. We go into another dimension.
Okay.
That's all there is to it.
All right.
We continue living, but we're living now in that other body, just as this oxygen is alive right here. You see. And so this is the way it is. We've set into motion through thought that this cancer, this takes place. What we think is important. Jesus said one thing in the Bible. He says, what you take into the mouth is not important, but what you take out is important. In other words, what you say, what you think.
Okay. All right. One thing I was thinking about when you were talking about, we're talking about women's bodies and not liking them.
Right.
The picture of that goddess came to my mind. They worship that goddess.
That's right.
Yes.
When you worship something, you tend to look at it as an ideal,
Right.
or the way you would like things to be.
Right.
Right.
I don't know any women, or let's put it this way. I would imagine, and there's the picture again, that many women really probably wouldn't feel too comfortable looking like this goddess today. Look at where we've come. How sad.
Yeah.
How sad
Well,
that that's the image.
In a sense that this image was an exaggerated female because it was making it as female as could be.
Right, okay.
You know, just like one of the other goddesses was Sybil, and she had maybe 25, 30 breasts on her,
Okay.
and because they were trying to make her as female as possible.
Symbolized more
Right, right.
femininity with the breasts
Right.
as an organ. Okay, I see.
He told me that his mother should not be worshipped. He said his mother died a natural death at 87 years old, very heavy in the build of the body, and she's buried in the ground, very close to the tomb where he was put, and that she died a natural death. She's not a virgin. That the people are making a mistake praying to her, that God is within inside of everybody. They're reaching outside of them. They're making a mistake that the religions should not have guided them to pray outside. He said when he was on the earth plane, he tried his best to teach the people that God was within. If they'd go back and read the book again and understand it, that he taught that to find the kingdom of God, look within yourself. And he said that he taught the truth. The church taught ignorance. Today it's recycled ignorance. Recycled ignorance.
Along with women's bodies and image, we have things like abortion, SIDS, miscarriage, all of these things that if you're a woman and you're part of this, rip you apart, and you're judged horrifically for some of these things. And I can only imagine, and we did talk about the idea that the soul does not come into the fetus until between the 3rd or the 4th month, so that there really isn't a life going on there, but yet women are beat up constantly for
Yes.
making a choice to abort prior to that.
Right.
Or families that suffer from sudden infant death syndrome, and you had said the soul simply was not the right time, or it made a mistake in coming into the body.
That's right.
It's a hard thing to absorb, and I wouldn't claim for a minute to know what these people go through, or miscarriage. But again, these are all products or things that women have to bear. And there really shouldn't be that stigma out there about women having to bear these burdens or judgments on all of these things. It's really tough enough. Look at what's happened with religion and the medical community.
Right.
Well, that's all that we have time for today. Wish we could chat more as we usually do. Want to thank my guests, Sidney Schwartz and Reverend Carl Hewitt. And I want to remind our viewers that we still have the email address that you can write to, making_known@yahoo.com. And there is a book, My First Encounter with an Angel, Revelations of Ancient Wisdom, to which both of these gentlemen are authors. And for information about any of those things, at the end of the show there is a phone number. I thank you all for watching. Until next time, be well.